But the account that he offers of the development of law is also heavily indebted to Darwin and sounds kind of like what Leopold says about morality. And it's a sort of a biosocial account too, right? Human beings are of necessity social animals. Survival depends on, it's not sort of, it is. It's the biosocial account of morality, right, that we get from Darwin that Collicutt thinks he can turn Leopold into, right? But Leopold's a sneaky guy, and he kind of escapes that Darwinist net, I think. Hopefully, he gets saved from being a sociobiologist. To say that Leopold is a sociobiologist, I think even Collicutt, everyone who knows Leopold would be appalled describing Leopold as a but that's the reading that that Collicutt kind of sends us in the direction of. So, in any event, all right, human beings are a necessity. This is the Darwinian account of morality. Again, one more time, with gusto. Survival depends on cooperation. Human life is more comfortably and enjoyably lived collectively and cooperatively because we're pathetic, weak animals. I mean, look at us. And we can't hardly defend anything with what we have compared to a bear or all kinds of other animals have way more survival skills than we do. But we have minds and we have this amazing communication ability, right? Which is where our minds probably come from, and are evolved, in symbiote, right? Evolved simultaneously, right? With the need for social skills and cooperation, right? But cetaceans are really good at communication too. But evidently their communication evolved quite differently than ours because their sensory apparatuses are quite different. And I think their communication kind of piggybacked on their echolocation, on their radar. Or excuse me, their sonar. They don't have radar, they have sonar. So they communicate with each other by transmitting sound waves, and through those sound waves are transmitted images. It's like fax machines. Their brains are like that. That's just how primitive way how we would describe it. But so when they're talking, when they're beeping and clicking and all that stuff underwater, they're telling their friends what they are experiencing, what they're seeing, and their friends are receiving an image of exactly that through those sound waves. Isn't that interesting? And so that's going to give them a very different kind of approach to communication than what us human animals have. Because we don't have echolocation. We don't have any sonar abilities. Anyway, so when we finally get around to interspecies communication, there are all these hurdles that we need to cross. It's not just a matter of translating, right? It's not just translating from a language, it's translating from a mode of experience, right? Then to a language. And anyway, it's something to work on, right? For all of you brilliant, get straight A's in all your biology classes, and you can spend your life studying these fascinating questions. Wouldn't it be cool to be paid to interact with dolphins? I mean, that's it, man, right? If you knew you had a job like that waiting for you, you would be very happy. Wouldn't you? Would anybody be sad? No, I don't think so. I mean, it'd have to be a decent salary, but I mean, 40, 50,000, sure. But it couldn't be it'd have to be it wouldn't be SeaWorld, obviously. What's interesting about those orcas, though, they've been demonstrated to become bilingual. When they put them in, all these fascinating things have been discovered about these cetaceans as a result of putting them in tanks. But evidently they've been observed learning how to talk dolphin, learning how to speak the way that dolphins speak, and then they start communicating with them. Which in the wild would probably never happen, although maybe that happens too, who knows? Anyway, but so, getting back to Darwin, this is the basic account. You've read all this before, right? It is evolutionarily advantageous for altruistic affections to extend beyond kinship. Right? This is really just a sociobiological account of the origins of moral norms, right? Moral reasoning, right? Moral reasoning helps us relate to people that we're not biologically related to, and that helps us and helps our families, right? In fact, we probably wouldn't flourish, and we probably might even die if we didn't have those kinds of moral bonds with our neighbors, right? And then the idea is, right, then the rest of the story is the development of modern civilization, right? These moral norms, these tribal altruistic relationships gradually, through the process of history, get extended outward until the entire global human community is included in our moral considerations, right? But not the non-human community, just the human community. All right, and then along comes Christopher Stone, and he gives us kind of this legalistic. He gives us kind of an extension of the law to more than human entities, right? Where Leopold kind of tries to show us how we can extend moral norms. But obviously right behind the surface, right beneath the surface of Stone's account, there has to be, and there is, an effort to explain the moral status of the human being and the moral status of the non-human being. Okay? Specifically of the ecological whole. Okay? So this is what the bottom of the page of notes here, this is all kind of review up here, right? Continual extension of social instincts and sympathies. This is again, this is the account of morality and law that both that Collicutt prefers, that Collicutt thinks Leopold prefers, right? And that figures prominently in the work of many of these thinkers. The pragmatists are also Darwinists, and they don't struggle with the metaphysical problems that Collicutt struggles with, by the way. Anyway, but the unthinkable this is what Christopher Stone wants to defend. His goal is to defend the unthinkable, and he just acknowledges right up front that in 1971, it was the unthinkable. It was ridiculous to propose that natural objects could be bearers of legal rights, could be recognized as legal entities, right, at law. I mean, entities with legal status, right? And here now he's getting a little bit loose with his comparisons in a way that I also came to object to when I pointed it out in Collicutt's story too, right? Collicutt too cites examples like women, children, African Americans, all kinds of minority, people are considered minorities, or non-property owning white men, basically, right? And but we're talking now about something that's even more deeply unthinkable, right? He cites these other examples because he wants to say, at various stages in Western history, the idea of recognizing rights in children was unthinkable. The idea of recognizing rights in women was unthinkable, right? And so he's saying, hey man, it's unthinkable today, but 100 years ago, the idea of women being lawyers was unthinkable. Anyone pick up on that footnote about the women lawyers in Wisconsin? What argument did the author of that Wisconsin Supreme Court justice, what theory, what tradition, what normative tradition did the author of that Wisconsin Supreme Court justice appeal to defend his claim that women can't be lawyers? What normative tradition? Yes?
Well, it said that their nature, that they can't be analytical.
Okay, and so what's he appealing to? There you go. See, it's everywhere. Natural law theory is everywhere. And it's slowly being sloughed off. But we still encounter it in areas involving human sexuality because it's still an aura of mysticism and religion has clouded that whole subject so much. And then we'll still encounter it sometimes in a person like Ron Arnold, who tries to smuggle in these natural law ideas. We still have some cultural authority among, unfortunately, too many parts of the United States culture. I'm always a little bit dismayed when I remember that I think a majority of American citizens don't believe in evolution. I have to kind of stop and... But yeah, that movie, I think I referenced it last term, Inherit the Wind with Spencer Tracy, is all about that, about this backwards part of American culture that refuses to accept even the theory of evolution, right? And that, of course, makes it difficult, right? Because the theory of evolution is inconsistent with these Bronze Age moral norms that our culture has inherited and clings to, that some aspects of United States culture clings to, right? Anyway, so just notice, again in passing, that it's one thing to say that now ships is a better, right? And then corporations, states, and churches too. At one time, none of these entities were recognized as bearers of legal rights, and so too, one day, we will come to recognize ecological whole, and we should, right? That's one of his big normative claims. Always ask yourself, what is the big normative claim that this author is making? And certainly one of his big normative claims is that we ought to do the unthinkable. All right? We ought to do the unthinkable. That's one of his big normative claims. And he says our culture would be better off, our society would be better off if we do the unthinkable. Okay? And just remember what the unthinkable is, recognizing that ecological wholes are bearers of legal rights. And then the philosophical question is, why? Is it because, okay, option one, is it because consequentially it's in the best long-term interests of human societies? Okay, that could be that's one very often cited answer, right, of why we ought to, okay? He says we ought to, so philosophers have to ask why, all right? One answer we've been over already many times. Another answer might be, though, that it's not just consequentially in our interest to treat them as though they have rights, but like these other entities here, up to here, like all these entities, right? They had moral status all along, and so we just need to adjust our legal system to recognize their moral. In the same way that we adjusted our legal system at various stages of our history to recognize the inherent moral status that these groups of humans had all along, right? Because we couldn't escape enlightenment. There's just no escaping enlightenment, no matter how hard you try. These ideas kind of seep into culture, and then that's the trajectory that history takes, is toward the recognition of the inherent dignity of the human being. And then there's no escaping, right? That all these groups end up being enfolded within the concept of legal rights bearers and moral status bearers, right? That's just going to happen, and it has, right? The last category may be sexual minorities, perhaps, among these groups of humans, right? Right? We could include non-heteronormative humans who identify with a non-heteronormative sexual orientation. Right? They'd be after the Asians, maybe. I don't know. Doesn't matter what order they, obviously. But so there was widespread opposition, right? It was unthinkable, right? And that there's an irony because there is going to be resistance because the thing that we're talking about recognizing as being a bearer of rights is not really valued, right? And so there's going to be resistance, and it's not until, for many people, it's not until after society makes the move to designate that entity as, finally recognize that entity as being a legal rights bearer, then that entity's value begins to become more clear to everybody, right? But it's hard, right? So how do you make that first step, right? It's almost always inevitably going to sound inconceivable to a large group of people. Okay? So these are the legal operational aspects. Next 2 pages, and then maybe we'll try to cover this before we get into the philosophical aspects, all right? But there are certain legal, there's certain things that have to be present for us to credibly say that a forest, for example, has rights. Here we're speaking just of legal rights. So none of this is philosophy, all right? This is just an important part of Stone's argument. This is, practically, this is his suggestion for how we might be able to, practically. Theoretically, he leaves it open, right? Theoretically, it's not clear. Stone is another one of these enigmatic figures, right? There are these enigmatic figures always lurking somewhere close behind our journey, or right near our journey. They're kind of the wild animals out there lurking. And one of them, of course, is Uncle Aldo, and one of them is Christopher Stone. These are these enigmatic figures who we're not quite sure what they're saying philosophically, okay? Christopher Stone, by the way, went on to become an environmental pragmatist 2 or 3 books down the road, and before he became an environmental pragmatist, even more amazingly, he actually started doing environmental ethics seriously and started going to conferences and educated himself. But when he first wrote this essay, he was just a young law professor. He got his Juris Doctor, his law degree, and then was lucky enough to be hired to teach, I think, at USC in Southern California. And he was drawn into doing environmental ethics after writing this essay, because he realized, hey, there are a lot of claims I'm making in here that are kind of provocative, and I need to explore these. And since then, he wrote, in the 80s and 90s, he's written 2 or 3 books in environmental ethics. Earth and Other Ethics is his most famous one. Christopher Stone's most famous book. Came out in the mid-90s, I think. Anyway, but this is how he thinks the system would work, okay? And when you have the whole picture in your mind, it's really not that exotic. It's really, it would involve considerably greater public investment in our legal system. It would involve making our legal system dramatically more accessible to the average person. But other than that, I mean, that would be big, right? A lot of people are calling for that already. But other than that, it wouldn't, it's not really that radical of an idea. And it kind of makes sense. The system that he proposes, it does seem to tie together pretty well, okay? But this is how he thinks it's going to work, okay? First of all, he points out that, look, we got to change our institutions, right? You can't talk about the rights of a forest, right? You can't say a forest has rights unless there are institutions set up to take care of those rights, okay? The entity has to be able to take action, institute legal action, right, in its own interests. The entity, the forest, for example, has to be able to be granted relief, right? It has to be eligible to actually be granted relief, right? Not just to the property owner, right? The tour company or whatever whose interests were damaged by the oil spill, for example, right? Not just to the humans who happen to, be harmed by the oil spill, but to the lake, the ocean, wherever that oil spilled, right? The land of the land itself, the swamp, the river that got damaged by the oil spill, okay? You can't say that river has its own rights unless it can seek redress on its own, right? Obviously not, you can't go to court, but it can have a guardian, okay? So the guardianship system is going to resolve all these problems and make it functionally possible for a forest to be a bearer of legal rights, okay? So just note too, since Stone's essay was written, we passed a number of environmental laws, okay? Now, the national parks have been around for a long time, but the Endangered Species Act was signed by Richard Nixon in 1973, I believe. 1 year after this essay, this decision came down. Oh, and by the way, on that list too, we're going to add Justice Douglas, right? So, Leopold, what's he saying? Stone, what's he saying philosophically? And then Justice Douglas. What's he saying? I'll read some of Justice Douglas's dissenting opinion. But put him up there. And then all the radical environmentalists. What are they saying? What are the DP colleges saying? Okay? We still don't know. We're trying to explain. We've explored. We've gone a long way to exploring one possible answer, this anthropocentric consequentialist answer, right? And now we're exploring some more exotic answers, all right? But the point that Stone makes is few, right? Even today, even after passage of the Endangered Species Act, very few objects can be described as being bearers of legal rights, right? Most things are just at the mercy of commercial forces, of commercial and industrial forces of development, right? And have no legal recourse whatsoever. If they happen to be endangered, then they do, but yeah.
That was, go ahead.
I'm sorry, am I missing two hands back there?
No, I was scratching my head.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Tyler.
One thing I got confused about with his guardianship is how does the guardian become the guardian? Like,
well,
who determines that?
It seems to me that you would have to petition. You would petition the court, and the court would routinely give guardianship to a petitioner who submitted enough evidence about the petitioner's relationship with the ecological whole. So if the petitioner came with credentials, belonging to a certain group of outdoor enthusiasts who commonly frequent, like the Sierra Club, right? So the Sierra Club would petition in this case. If Stone's legal system had already been in place before this Mineral King case went down, then what would have happened is the Sierra Club, rather than filing suit, having to fight some big federal bureaucracy, would have just filed a petition asking the court to appoint it as guardian. And it would cite all its evidence how members of our group have been going for 6 decades, to visit this place, and we have a whole library of materials about it, and et cetera, whatever. Anyway, if there's enough evidence, I think that would answer your question in the same way that the person who is concerned about an orphan child has to file a petition with the court. The court's not going to act until somebody's filed a petition. If the child is totally orphaned, then obviously some state, somebody from the welfare agency is going to have to file a petition. But and I think that's what he imagines. He imagines the Supreme Court crafting a new rule, and I don't really understand how that would work. Maybe I should understand more, having been to law school, but I do understand how Congress could pass a law directing. Congress has virtually plenary power. Our judicial system is almost entirely up to Congress to make. Even the number of Supreme Court justices is not specified. It just says there are going to be these couple different aspects of our, and then all the rest is. Anyway, Congress could pass a law directing all state, local, and federal courts to accept petitions for guardianship on behalf of inanimate objects. And we have to specify, right? I mean, where do we draw the line? What kind of ecological whole, right? I mean, this is all very speculative, and right? And the devil's in the details. How would all this work? He's giving us a rough guideline, but the question, how would the guardian be appointed? He doesn't answer that, does he? So there's a lot more work to be done practically, before we could figure out how this is all, Anyway, but let's get through one more page here. So if we are to build a legal system that respects and protects non-human natural entities, the system must provide for a court appointment of legal guardians. Okay, and these legal guardians would do the same kinds of things that legal guardians of orphan children do, right? They watch out for their affairs. If they're being damaged, they ask the court to stop that entity from damaging them and to perhaps even award damages, right? Give them some money, right? If they've been damaged by some crooked person. So they have to be able to seek redress, right? And a guardian would be entrusted with all those powers, invested with all those powers, to ask the court, right? And then the court would have to hear testimony. Believe me, there would be, okay, climate system. Appoint a guardian for the climate system, right? This is how it would work. James Hansen would be the unanimous choice. Perhaps, maybe there'd be some others, but he's a former director of NASA. He's eminently qualified. So, and then James Hansen would be, well, let's say he's appointed guardian. He could also be called as an expert witness. But anyway, the judge would have to hear a bunch of testimony. And believe me, ExxonMobil and all these companies that are benefiting from a filthy business model that involves extracting the remains of ancient life, carbon deposits, and then burning those, refining them, and then sending them off to be burned and put up into the atmosphere is an extremely dirty and dangerous and destructive, and very, very harmful business model. And yet, ExxonMobil and a lot of very powerful entities, very powerful businesses have a lot invested, right? And they want to maintain that business model. They're going to defend it. So they're going to send their expert witnesses, right? And the judge is going to have to listen to both sides. And the expert witnesses for ExxonMobil and all the energy companies are they're going to have these very good expert witnesses, right? With all the right credentials, PhD in climate science and what have you. And they're going to be presenting all kinds of testimony about how extraction and refinement and burning of fossil fuels doesn't harm the atmosphere, right? And then the judge is going to have to figure it all out based on science, right? And Stone thinks, actually, that this system of legal guardianship is going to be much more effective in protecting natural resources than the system we have now, all right? Would you agree, Tyler? Would it be more effective the way he envisions it?
Not really, because ExxonMobil could just make themselves a guardian and abandon theirs.
No, that would be the debate. That's what a judge would have to be decided. That's what the judge would have to decide, yeah.
But then they could just pay the judge off, and the judge would be like, okay, here, Exxon, this is yours.
But it seems to me that we're talking now about thousands, tens of thousands of separate legal actions to defend hundreds of thousands of different ecological wholes. And it seems to me that it's much more difficult for extractive industry to buy off thousands of local judges than it's much easier to buy off Congress. That's his argument too. That's a big part of Stone's argument. He says this is going to be a much more efficient and much more effective way of protecting our natural resources because it's a lot easier. And right now, he points out that the Forest Service and most of the federal agencies entrusted with managing our natural resources are corrupt. They've been corrupted, and they're not acting on behalf of the integrity of the ecosystem at all. They're acting on behalf of the integrity of an industry, right? An industry who has inserted its representatives into government, right, and bought off an agency. Anyway, so he thinks this is going to be much more effective. And so let me ask this though, and then we'll take a break. Would Stone's proposal to modify our legal system be better characterized as a socialist proposal or as a civil libertarian proposal? Anybody have enough facility with those two kind of social political concepts to? Yes.
I'd say civil libertarian, if only because it's relying on the will of individuals to rise up and defend, rather than having the government administer protection.
Mm-hmm. It's a legal expansion of the realm of personal privacy to include protection from noxious fumes and poison in our water and our air, right? Stone envisions a system in which everyone in this room, the common man and the common woman, can walk into a courtroom and ask to be included in part of this giant lawsuit against ExxonMobil and other energy companies that have knowingly befouled things that we all rely upon. And yet it's not calling for a top-down revolution, and that would be the difference, right? A civil libertarian would be perfectly happy with Stone's proposal. He's just saying, look, the system right now is unfair because it allows business owners to externalize the cost of doing business and to throw off the cost of pollution onto the public, right? And that's totally unfair. And so what we need to do is we need to attach the correct monetary amount to their damages, objectively. And the only objective way to measure the damages to the environment caused by ExxonMobil is to measure them as damages to Earth's climate systems, right? Not just as damages to all of our lungs. And guess what? That probably makes the amount of damages much greater, right? And then that money, and it's, right, if this all happened, then believe me, the judge would conclude that ExxonMobil needs to be dissolved, all their assets need to be seized, sold off, and the asset and the money taken from their assets needs to be used to conduct massive tree planting campaigns. Right? Let's go. All right, let's do it. Let's get Stone's system in place. Let's get the trial going. Let's do it all legally, above board. Find out an objective measurement of damages caused by ExxonMobil, and just a standard, a few others, right, to our climate systems. And then just say, look, dude, we're not going to pay for this anymore. Somebody has got to pay for the billions of trees that need to be planted if we're serious about getting carbon out of the atmosphere back into the soil where it belongs. We need to plant millions and millions of trees all over the world. And that can't just be volunteer work, right? That involves a huge investment of money. And the public is tired of footing the bill for these pigs with their filthy business model. So we need to change our system to build into the system accountability for the harm to climate systems themselves, right? And then these giant companies won't be able, and they'll have to change their practices, right? Because continuing their business model the way it is now will just add up astronomically to their cost of doing business, right? Because they'll just have to keep paying into this fund, right? You see how that all works? Anyway, and isn't it beautiful? It sounds good, doesn't it? It sounds better than the system we have now, at the very least, right? Is it too scary? Is the person doesn't have the right sneakers to present, right? I mean, is that what's important? You got to have the right public image, or is it enough just to see, hey, this is going to work a lot better? What do you guys think? You're supposed to think about these things and dream about implementing them, right? That's kind of the idea when you're in college, right? You dream big and you think big, and then you try to tackle all the problems that might come along. Yeah.
I feel like the only way to make the guardianship unbiased is if you made it so the guardian can have no financial advantage from
Of course.
the land.
That's obvious.
Well, that in itself would make Exxon.
Is it so extreme and bizarre to think about making natural resource decisions on the basis of what ecologists and biologists know about how those resources work? Is it so extreme? Is Baxter right in the end? After all, we've read 3 weeks of material since Baxter. Does anyone in the room, maybe some people do, and that's okay, still agree that there is no normative nature? Isn't the entire body of academic ecology built on the idea, and isn't that what ecologists have spent the last 100 years demonstrating to the world? That in fact ecosystems are wholes, they have integrity, they have stability, they can be defined, and there is a normative state of an ecosystem. If you take the long-term view, there's a normative state. Yes, species go extinct, other species come in, but over millions of years, an ecosystem retains its essential identity. Okay? Not always, right? And interruptions of that integrity and stability don't have to necessarily be human. Humans might have, under the land ethic, might have an obligation to prevent an ecosystem from being harmed by a volcano, for example, or by an asteroid. Even though that's not a human-caused event, right? An event that's going to disrupt the long-term stability of an ecosystem, humans have something to do with it, right? Humans have to respond to that somehow. And anyway, I sense too many people trying to use nature as a model, and I would steer all of you away from that. And I think Leopold himself tries to steer us away from just saying it's wrong because it's not natural, right? There are many not natural things that humans do that aren't wrong from Leopold's point of view, all right? But we can identify the point at which an ecological whole is broken, okay? Objectively. Is that too strong of a claim? We can identify the point at which an ecological whole is broken, at which its integrity and stability are broken. Maybe that is too strong of a claim. And maybe then your point is well taken, okay? That we cannot reach an objective. It's all going to be so politically biased. Is that your point? It's all going to be so biased in one way or another. It seems like an anti-science point, though, because isn't that the assumption of science, right? That science can tell us what's objectively going on here?
I mainly just meant that there's no way a company could have guardianship with that law. Because if they're going to be financially attached to it, that means that they're
Yes.
already know.
I think that's beyond dispute that no representative of ExxonMobil could be appointed guardian, but they could have their own guardian in mind, and they would submit their own petition, and then the judge would have to decide which guardian to appoint. And the judge, though, would have to base his decision on scientific data, right? About the effects of whatever actions the environmentalist is worried about. In this case, building the ski resort, right? The judge is going to have to base his decision on scientific data about the effects of that ski resort on the integrity and stability and beauty of that ecological whole, right? It seems harder to corrupt, you know. I mean, right now, we got congressmen just pulling stuff out of their butts and passing it into law, you know, because they've been paid to do this and bribed by all these lobbyists, right? I mean, any system that's closer to what Stone is advocating seems to be better than the system we have now. Do you guys realize what a corrupt society we live in? You're aware of that? Did you ever hear about a country called the Soviet Union? They were dissolved in, what, 1990 or something? They kind of went by the boards.
91.
But many historians think, point to that society as being the most heavily